Hello, my name is Dr. Jeffrey Barsuk. I am the Robert Herstick Professor of Medicine and Medical Education at Northwestern University Feinberg School of Medicine. I currently serve as the Executive Medical Director of Northwestern Simulation. I'd like to welcome you back to another podcast in our series on simulation and healthcare education. Today, I have the distinct honor of interviewing Dr. Eve Purdy. Eve is an emergency medicine physician at Gold Coast University Hospital in Queensland, Australia. She has a master's degree in applied anthropology and completed fellowships in research and translational simulation and team performance. Today, we will be discussing her specific focuses on her research interests, namely in how culture can help shape education, as well as how simulationists can be better with diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI, within their simulation curricula. Eve, it's an honor to interview you today.
Thanks. I'm thrilled to be here.
So I usually start my podcast with some background information about yourself and how you got involved in simulation.
Yeah, sure. I am Canadian, though living in Australia now. And I am an emergency physician, did my emergency training in Canada, and along the way did a master's in applied anthropology, actually through the University of North Texas. So I did that kind of in step with my emergency training. And the master's that I did had a thesis component, and I actually did that thesis work down here in Australia, looking at how trauma teams work together. And I guess my intersection with simulation specifically is kind of a marriage of all of those things coming together. I really am a child of simulation as a trainee who grew up really with it being a part of my training from the very beginning. So from the get-go, day one of my emergency medicine training, I had the good fortune of being involved as a participant in simulation, and that really becoming an absolutely critical way that I learned about emergency medicine and learned some really kind of critical personal skills to make me a better emergency physician. And so it was pretty natural that during my thesis work, some of the focus that we took was understanding how trauma teams use simulation to improve their team performance. So I got a little bit more embedded in understanding the role of simulation, and it really identified simulation as a ritual that teams kind of came together to do to get better. And then since then, I've really kind of taken a dive into understanding how simulation impacts teams, but also how it impacts culture and how it can shape our values and attitudes and beliefs.
So I'm going to date myself a little bit now because when I trained, we didn't use simulation very much. In fact, the only simulation that we were using was the Harvey cardiac simulator, and the teams never got together to train on simulation. So we've come a long way with that, but I think that that's a fascinating thing that you just mentioned, that the rituals of what we do in medicine, and that's going to come right out of, I assume, your applied anthropology training, because I don't normally hear that term ritual in medicine, but I think it's pretty awesome how you described it that way. So can you just give me a little bit of more information about how your applied anthropology degree affects your views on medical education and your views as a doctor, since you use the term ritual?
Oh, yeah, you bet. So really the way that I got interested in anthropology was because as I was going throughout my medical training, we bounced around from specialty to specialty, from group to group. And there was a bit of medicine to be learned, but there was really a lot underneath the surface in terms of kind of cultural learning and fitting in. And I started to realize that all of these different groups in the hospital actually just have a different set of rules that you have to play by. And I was interested in how that shapes the way that we look after patients, the way that we interact with each other. And I thought that anthropology, the study of culture, would really be a unique and kind of helpful lens through which to see these types of issues. So when I think about how that shapes my views on medical education, I think it's no surprise that the medical education process is a bit about learning, but a lot about enculturation. And so I definitely am a little bit biased towards seeing and understanding education as a enculturation of teaching values and beliefs and attitudes to people as much as it is about transferring knowledge.
It's changed a lot over the years as well. For the better, I think, but we're not there yet. But as far as the culture of, at least when I was a student, I felt individually that students were meant to be seen, not really heard. It was the student that was willing to speak up that tended to get the better grade. So individuals that were more quiet were thought not to be as smart. And this is going to be a segue kind of into what we're going to talk about next, because I know that we're both firm believers that when we train together with simulation, that we can change that culture and make things be better for everybody on the team.
Yeah, I mean, that's the ultimate hope. I think, though, that puts a lot of pressure on people in simulation to get the conditions right to make that happen. Really, from the work we've done, we found that simulation is this incubator of culture. So it really magnifies culture and is a time when that culture is transferred with a fair degree of kind of weight and intensity to the people who are participating. And so those powers can be used for both good and evil, I suppose. And I think one of the things I want people in simulation to think most about is just being mindful of what actually are the cultural signals that we're sending, because there's the possibility of shaping culture in a way towards maybe the version of medicine that we want it to be. But there is also the possibility to send really strong kind of problematic cultural signals in simulation as well.
Well, and that's the other thing, because we had another podcast about creating a safe learning environment. And that is not a process that happens just because you decree it so, right? And it is certainly not a process that occurs with one simulation. You have to gain rapport with your learners, and they have to get to a point where they actually can feel safe. And that's very complex for some people. And understanding that on the individual level gets into some of your DEI work that we're going to talk about. But talk to me a little bit more about some of your work with culture in the emergency room and how it pertains to medical education. You wrote a paper that I was very interested in called Taking Simulation Out of Its, quote, Safe Container, Exploring the Bidirectional Impacts of Psychological Safety and Simulation in an Emergency Department. Can you talk a little bit about what that study was and what your findings were?
Yeah, so we took a look at our simulation program in the emergency department. And I think one of the important things to think about is that this simulation program is quite well established, just in the way that you mentioned that this rapport takes kind of time to build up. We studied a simulation program that has been ongoing for 6 or 7 years, a weekly simulation with registrars and nurses. And we were really interested in understanding what are the impacts of that simulation, because I think for a long time we've thought about what are the things that individual learners take away. But when you think about the investment that this is at a department level, we would hope that there are actually some department level outcomes that come from this. I mean, I'm happy if the registrar feels more comfortable cardioverting a patient, but I actually would hope that there's something at the department level that this investment does for our teams, not just individuals. So we were interested in understanding, what does simulation do for the teams? And so we did surveys and interviewed people who've participated in this simulation program. And there was kind of 3 key findings. So the first finding was that people bring a lot with them into simulation. And the status and the culture of a team before they enter that room is actually very important in understanding how they're going to be able to engage with that simulation. So if a team feels really safe together, they feel like they can take interpersonal risks, they feel like they trust each other, then when they come into simulation, they might be a lot more inclined to get as much from it as is possible. The other important piece to consider there is that they've got a history with the facilitator as well, and thinking really long and hard about who the facilitator of that program is, so that it is somebody that people trust and respect and have some credibility with. That can go a long ways. But then what we see is that these teams come into the simulation And then when they're in there, that's kind of where the magic happens. They take some risks together. They face a hard problem. They then have the opportunity to talk about teamwork in some higher level ways that they're not used to. And certainly something magical happens there. But what we see is that goes with them out to the floor when they work that shift and the next month and the next time they see each other. We see that they are more familiar with each other. They trust each other more. They get this sense that we're trying to get better as a department. So they get the sense that we're an organization that is interested in continuous improvement. And really, they go back to the workplace with kind of this powerful feeling and sense of team that was fostered in the simulation. So there's this joke in the simulation community, or not joke, I've heard it said many times, what happens in simulation stays in simulation. But we basically show that that's not the case, and nor should it necessarily be the goal. We want people to be respectful of other people's performance, but we certainly don't want to keep what happens in simulation staying in simulation.
I think about teams that are diverse, but teams that may never have worked together in a real emergency situation. For instance, in our hospital, if we have a cardiac arrest on the floor, a cardiac arrest team comes and there's various people on the team and they may never have worked with each other. That sounds like that could be a problem. It almost sounds like we should have enough simulations where we get them chances to work to each other. So how do you deal with that in settings such as that?
Oh, I mean, that would be the goal. Could we train all of our teams to work together all the time? We certainly can't do that, not in the emergency department, not in the flash resuscitation teams. But what we can do is empower and give these professionals tools to build micro familiarity in those new moments. So a lot of our simulations are about doing an excellent pre-briefing or an excellent team briefing or excellent recaps. These are tools that build familiarity rapidly in a short period of time for teams that have just come together. So creating kind of a norm around basically a norm of a suite of tools that people can use in any situation to build rapport with new teammates. I mean, it would be great if we could all train together like Navy SEALs, but that's not how modern healthcare works. So we've got to come up with some other ways to face the challenges of dynamic teams.
And we overuse the example of the airline industry and simulation, and even pilots aren't always working with the same individuals when they're on a plane. So it doesn't, we have to have people prepared to work with diverse teams. And if they know their roles on that team and everyone's taught, the basic rules of either crisis resource management or team steps or whatever team training you're using, it creates an environment where people can speak up and feel comfortable learning together. And that definitely can be done through simulation.
Yeah. And I think if we take it one step further and we think about what are the outcomes that we're interested in. So you and I have been talking about a lot of behaviors, but I think if we can think about an outcome of simulation being the culture, that is actually even better, because it means we don't even need to train everybody in the behaviors, because the culture creates the conditions in which the good behaviors just happen. So if you have worked at creating a culture, your simulation increases the psychological safety of your organization, then all of a sudden you don't need to train people to speak up, because they just will, because this is a culture in which that is accepted. So for me, I think if we focus on, or we think about how do you take advantage of simulation potentially being able to shape culture, then all of a sudden we reduce the need to train a whole bunch of people in behaviors, because we've set the cultural conditions such that good behaviors will happen.
The difficult thing is, how do you measure that? How do you do, 100 simulations on team training in the emergency room and then measure the changes in culture and the real environment?
Yeah, I mean, I guess this is where the positivist worldview is a little bit problematic, to be honest, because I'm less interested in proving that something works and a little bit more interested in understanding how it works and what conditions and why. So I think no matter what we do in simulation, there will be some impact, and we just have to figure out what that is. So for example, when we were looking at how simulation impacts psychological safety within our emergency department, we decided to talk to people and ask them. We have done some more kind of quantitative work looking at psychological safety, but one of the real problems is that culture takes years and years to change. So you're not going to start a simulation program and then the next year detect a change in your culture. This is something that takes a long time to change and is impacted by all sorts of things. It's not like when you teach somebody CPR and then the next day you can measure if the depth of their compressions is good and their rate is good. This is a complex thing, which doesn't mean that it can't be studied, but it just means that we probably have to talk to people. We probably have to observe. So when we looked at trauma teams, part of the way that we identified simulation as an important ritual for them was that I did an ethnography of the trauma service. So I spent a year here in Australia, following them around, talking with people on the service, chatting with them about what's important, what impacts them. And time again, this monthly kind of simulation that we do that gets at all the interfaces of people who are involved in trauma came up as something that was really important to people and shaped the way that they think about their work and they think about their colleagues, and was a time when they got together and see trauma as important and get better at it. So it was through kind of an ethnography, which is the traditional anthropologic way of studying things, that we were able to kind of conceptualize simulation as a ritual for our trauma service. So there's ways to do it, whether they're as accepted by the positivist medical establishment. I guess that's up for debate.
Well, that's what I'm getting at, because when we get our funding for next year's simulation, we have to convince the hospital executives that there's a return on investment there. And we often struggle with showing, because there's no doubt. I mean, know it, I know it, that culture does change over time. I've seen it. We have some indirect measures of that. But if we could really capture it and attribute it to our simulations, that would be amazing to show the C-suite so that we can get that funding for the next year to do the same.
Oh man, Jeff, this is like a gold mine for C-suite funding right now. Honestly, like how many hospitals have a Speaking Up for Safety program that costs tens of millions of dollars to train all of their people in, and now you get to go and say, look, this is an intervention that we know can shape culture. That is going to cost you less than training all of your people in behaviors. So I think is at least some of the evidence that we're creating hopefully will help with that business case for other people, because C-suites are obsessed with organizational culture right now, and simulation is definitely a path to impacting it in a meaningful way. So whether it's your own local data or drawing on just some evidence from elsewhere, we really don't have much good evidence for what impacts organizational culture. But I think this is one of the things that we are starting to build a bit of an evidence base around.
We had an interesting observation in some of our work in central line training. We've been doing central line procedural training, since like 2005, maybe earlier. And what we noticed is we would take second year residents right before and you call them registrars. I wanted to clarify that, but we call them residents, and we take them right before their ICU rotation. And part of our curriculum is that they do a pretest first. And what we were finding is over time that our residents were getting better and better at the pretest yearly. And we asked ourselves, why is that? And when we kind of delved into a little deeper, we feel that is from vicarious learning from other generations of residents that rotated with these residents when they were first year residents, and they were bringing that knowledge. So that's kind of some maybe circumstantial evidence to show culture changes from simulation training, even with a procedure.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. That's awesome.
Well, let's so we're talking about cultural change, and let's take that into a setting of DEI, because certainly if we don't include DEI into our simulation curricula, it's going to be really hard for some individuals to feel comfortable, feel psychologically safe, but as well as the culture can't move forward, in my opinion, if we're not taking these things into account. So I wanted to delve into that, because this is just like, I'm so glad that this has come to the forefront of universities' priority list, because what took us so long, right?
Yeah, I think uh, there's been a number of things in the past 5 years that really have brought this to people's consciousness. It's not that it has not always been a problem, but I think there's been a series of kind of public events and just a movement in the societal kind of dialogue about this. As an aside, I was rewatching Friends this week, and just was blown away by the lack of diversity, the stereotyping, a lot of really problematic things in what was just normal popular culture, kind of in the late 90s and early 2000s. So I think we are probably following along a natural progression that certainly is not fast enough, but it's not terribly surprising that it's taken us a bit of time to get here.
Well, in fact, watching some of those older sitcoms or watching some of the older movies, it's appalling that that we were okay with that back then. And some things that I've watched, I've just cringed, and I'm like, wow, if this was released today, we would have people protesting in front of the movie theater.
Yeah, exactly. And I think just in the same way that pop culture is a bit of an incubator of culture, we can think about simulation in the same way. So I would venture that we all have some simulation experiences that we look at and look back at, and even ones that are ongoing now that we think, maybe I would have done that differently. And I think all we can do is reflect on that and move the needle a bit. And it's, now is a good time.
Yeah, so let's talk about that. So how do we do that? What have you discovered through your work as to how we can best be more diverse, equitable, and inclusive in our simulation?
Yeah, so there's not a simple answer to that question. And I think I'll just highlight that as a simulation community, we're at the point where in the literature, there's all these calls to be doing it better. But I think there's a real gap in the conversation because there's a bunch of people like you and I going, yeah, we agree, we want to do it better, but what do we actually do? And then there's also a group of people who say, yeah, we should be doing it better, and then race into doing something without really clear understanding of the potential consequences and problems in certain ways of approaching this. So I think one of the most important things that we can do is actually bridge that gap between thinking we need to do something better and doing something better. And so how do we fill that space? And that's where I think we can really look at some important theory. So critical theory is the perfect lens to be taking to understand this problem. So critical theory is used really as an important way to understand inclusivity and equity for any number of groups. They specifically look at gender and race, but you can apply it to almost any problem. And the concept is that this is something that is pervasive in our everyday institutions and decisions, and there's kind of not anything that it doesn't impact. And one of the most important ways and important aspects of these theories is reflexivity. This concept that we need to be reflecting on who we are and what power dynamics are at play and how our background impacts everything, essentially. And so I think that is where I've focused a lot of kind of my attention around where the simulation community needs to improve, is probably actually focusing on ourselves a little bit, and understanding who we are and how who we are impacts our decisions and impacts our actions as a starting place to bridge this gap between kind of the theoretical understanding we need to do better and actually doing better.
Can we get into some of the nitty gritty on how that happens when you're building your curriculum? Because I don't know, I'm thinking that if we train clinicians properly, maybe with simulation, maybe in other curricula as well, and we can remove some of the biases from there, some of the systemic racism, et cetera, with diversity, inclusion, and equitability, maybe we can remove some of the implicit biases we see in actual patient care.
Oh, I mean, that would be the dream. We decided to kind of lean into this more accessible kind of type of reflexivity, which I stumbled across in a geography, kind of sociology article of all places. I find myself down a few deep rabbit holes. But this talks about kitchen table reflexivity. And what they found is that basically colleagues, by talking to each other casually, but specifically about power and positioning over time, can actually really enhance their own reflexivity. So the concept is that if you talk with your colleagues about this on a regular basis, you will gain some insights that will be helpful in they were talking about research, but I think for us will be helpful in our role as facilitators. There wasn't really kind of a good conversational tool to help get that started. So our group decided to design just a really simple tool that we can use to get these regular conversations started. And we basically decided that we weren't going to change anything kind of deliberately in our curriculum. We weren't going to jump into doing anything, but we were going to commit to having regular conversations about our own positioning and our own power over kind of a year. So our simulation delivery team, which is about 10 of us that deliver our ED simulations, committed that over the year, after every single one of our sessions, we were going to have a quick conversation about equity, diversity, and inclusion and our own power and our own positioning in relation to the simulation that we just delivered. So I can tell you a little bit about the tool if you want. So it's pretty simple, to be honest. We just created a tool that gets us, after we've delivered a simulation, so the group that delivered it, to come together and talk about what aspects of the simulation design, delivery, or debriefing were related to gender, race, sexuality, culture, and how did that unfold and with what impact. So that was kind of just the general, was there anything in this simulation that was particularly relevant to EDI? And then we think about, were there any missed opportunities? So in the design, delivery, or debriefing, was there an opportunity to better incorporate or explore issues related to EDI, and what prevented us from doing so, and what would we do differently? And that was at kind of each of the design phases. We had a specific question about harms. So were there any potential or real harms associated with this session? So stereotyping or not addressing bias or microaggressions that came up. We had a couple prompting questions about why do we think that happened? Do we need to actually address them now? Is there something that we need to do now if we didn't address it in the session? And what might we do differently in the future? And then we had a final question about our potential sources of bias as they relate to the simulations today, and is there a way for us to mitigate them? And then were there any action items that we needed to do? So did we need to adjust the case? Did we need to send an email out to the participants with some information? And did we need any kind of further training or resources? So it sounds like a lot, but it actually is oftentimes a pretty quick conversation. And those are all just kind of prompts that can get a discussion going. We found that oftentimes, there might be one thing that we then ended up talking about as a group.
So you're doing that during designing the sim, during actually giving the sim, and then during the sim debriefing afterwards?
Well, so we actually just used this tool. So we would run a simulation, our usual Thursday simulation. We would run it through, we do the debrief with the participants, and then this would actually just be afterwards with the simulation delivery team. So the people that actually gave the simulation, we'd get together afterwards anyways to talk about, hey, how did the sim go today? Is there anything we need to change? And we just incorporated this into that conversation. And so it was kind of after the fact that we did this as a reflection on kind of the simulation that we'd provided.
Got it. So can you give me an example of something you discovered and how you then went ahead and changed your sim for the better?
Yeah, well, so this is the interesting part. We're actually just about to publish a manuscript on this, and I would say that the changes that we made were very subtle. So when we entered into this conversation, I think a lot of people in our group were thinking we were going to design a whole bunch of new simulations to address implicit bias or to deal with specific patient populations. That is not how this panned out. The changes were much more subtle. So I guess one example that I can give you is we ran a simulation, and one of the leaders was a female registrar. And there was kind of a carrot in the reactions phase about maybe how gender impacted this, but the person who was running the debrief didn't actually engage in that conversation and didn't go down that path. And so we ended up having a conversation as a group about, why didn't we enter that conversation? And why didn't we explore that with the group, this kind of gender difference in leadership? And we ended up talking with the debriefer, who was one of my male colleagues, and he kind of said, I just didn't feel like I had the credibility to lead that conversation. And then we unpacked that, and we talked about some kind of conversational skills that he could apply the next time to feel like he could enter that conversation.
It's interesting because I'm reflecting now on some of the simulations that we oversee in our lab. And so we have curriculum submitted to the leadership in our group for approval before they're brought to the lab. And we actually have an implicit bias checklist that we can use to make sure that to try and remove the implicit bias from the actual curriculum. Although right now we're not very good at using it for sim. As you learn it and you try and be sensitive to it, you're going to get it wrong. And it's hard.
Yeah, it is hard. Yeah. It breaks down to this. There's simulation that we do every day that needs to be equitable and diverse and inclusive. And then there is simulation with specific objectives related to EDI. So, implicit bias training or simulation with specific patient populations as the, issues to them related to, as the learning objective. And I think you and I need to get really good at thinking about our everyday simulation and how EDI impacts that. But I certainly haven't gotten to the point where I feel like I have the skills and abilities to step into that next type of simulation that is with specific learning objectives related to EDI. One of the things that we found, or one of the things that I was most humbled by in some of the writing around this, was really the care and attention that it takes to get it right. So there's one group out of Canada that has recently just published an article about basically how to design simulation with EDI kind of specific related objectives. And the care and effort in community consultation and every step of the way just slowing down, and really it is harder than writing a simulation about a cardiac arrest that you and I are very good at, and searching for that expertise outside of ourselves, and going through kind of a really big community consultation process. It really highlighted for me that really a lot of us are not actually well positioned to do this.
The only way that we can move forward is having honest conversations and trying to learn together how we can do it for everybody.
Yeah, I think so. And I think that for our group, using this tool is what it allowed us to do. So one of our kind of key findings was that the tool just normalized conversations around EDI. And so, all of a sudden it wasn't odd for us to be having this conversation. It wasn't that I think you're a bad person because you didn't enter this conversation about race or gender. This is actually just something that we talk about regularly and we think about as a group. So I think if we can find ways to normalize the conversation, hey, that's probably as good an outcome as any that I have right now.
Well, fascinating conversation. I learned a ton as always. I was humbled a little bit too, which is good for me. I wanted to give you the opportunity also before we conclude to plug any websites or creations that you have that you think are important on this topic for our listeners.
So yeah, sure. There's a couple of things I'd like to plug. So We've got this tool available on IceNet. I'd encourage you to go take a look. It's just a blog post with the tool available, and feel free to give it a try with your simulation group. We also have done a podcast on Simulcast, which is a simulation podcast, specifically just as we were starting using this tool as a group. So that might be a good place to go as well. There's just an amazing issue released by Clinical Simulation in Nursing. Their October 22 issue is all about diversity, equity, and inclusion in simulation. So a whole bunch of articles that are complete gold there, and it would be a great starting point for anybody that's interested in learning more.
Great stuff. It was just so awesome to talk to today. You made me think about so many new things that I want to do now, incorporating your checklist or your tool into our post simulation debriefings, as well as being a little stronger with our implicit bias tool and our curriculum, doing it up front when we evaluate them. So thank you so much for taking the time this morning for you and this evening for me, I guess, but I appreciate it.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks for having me.
Well, to our listeners, thank you for listening today. And we look forward to seeing you in our next podcast, where we discuss key aspects of simulation healthcare education with experts in the field. Bye for now.